So that's resolved very easily. Item 11, colleagues, the tram train, and it's the interior layout. David, you're going to introduce this, and Polly has got the 5 minutes to actually make a representative on behalf of the cyclists in Sheffield as well. David.
Yes, thank you. This paper, I mean, it's clearly a difficult paper because there are a whole load of opposing demands for a space on the tram, but so people are clear about today's paper, it is actually a discussion and debate about the design of the proposed tram train vehicle, which is currently being scheduled for manufacture, and we have to sign off some of the design brief of that as of this meeting. So today's discussion is actually about the design of the tram rather than the principle of do we carry cycles on tram trains. But very clearly implicit in the design decision, you can design out the option of carrying cycles on tram trains, or you can come up with a design that would facilitate that, should that be shown how to work safely in the future. Also, the discussion on new tram train is not a conversation in isolation. We've had around this table very challenging debates about do we allow cycles on the existing Supertram vehicles, and they were very difficult decisions, but in the end this meeting came to a decision that they would prioritise wheelchair, pushchair users, the elderly and infirm, above the needs of cyclists on the existing tram vehicles. But very clearly in making that difficult decision that only related to the Supertram vehicle and doesn't apply to other vehicles. And that is why today's papers come back. The tram train vehicle is a different vehicle, and therefore we have to re-examine the position in terms of that vehicle. So I don't suggest that this morning's discussion is going to be any easier than it has been in the past, but it's absolutely right that we ask ourselves the question and come up with the right design of vehicle for our future needs in transport terms. So turning to the tram train vehicle itself, there are constraints on the design which we have to have regard to. Some of these are legal obligations. We have statutory obligations in terms of accessibility and the provision for wheelchair users and a certain volume of priority seating for particular vulnerable members of our community. There are also physical constraints that we can't ignore either, and physical constraints are about the design of the vehicle, but the design of the vehicle is influenced by the wheel size, location. It needs a certain number of drive units on it because of the gradients the Supertram system utilises, and also we have low platform heights. And again, all of these things come together to have a constraining effect on what we can do with the vehicle design. To guide the discussions, we've also undertaken consultation. Details of that are in the paper. But one of the key things we wanted to understand was in the hierarchy of people who are competing for use of the tram train vehicle, and in particular the limited low floor space on the tram train vehicle, what did people think the hierarchy of users were? Almost without exception, there was a very broad consensus about that, and that's set out in the report. And that included the cycle groups as well. Everybody agreed wheelchair users were the top priority for the low floor space. Everybody recognised there were needs for the elderly and infirm, and there were demands for people with pushchairs and young children, for example. So there's a lot of consensus around the importance of providing for these people. And some of that debate was played out in public meetings. So Sheffield on the Move, for example, had a very healthy debate around the pros and cons and different demands for different users. And I've tried to capture some of that in the appendix and in the main body of the report. To me, it then gets sort of crystallised in the two letters we've got. There are very clear views. We've got a letter attached to page 35 of today's agenda from Sheffield Council, who have passed a resolution, and on balance their view is they would prefer option 2, which accommodates the option of carrying cycles in the future. In contrast, Rotherham Council, with the letter I've circulated around and it's on the table, prefer the option 1 solution, and that's the one where the priority is given to these other more vulnerable users, and cyclists aren't carried. And I don't think there's a right or wrong decision here. I think we just have to reach a balanced view on it, and the paper tries to work through those views. In the design options now, turning to the options that are attached to the back of the paper, option 1, which is the one in the recommendation, puts the priority seating in the low floor area of the tram between the 2 doors, opposite the wheelchair space. The difference with option 2 puts half of the priority seating up one step and across the articulated part of the trams, so forcing those people who are elderly, infirm, depend on those priority seating, placing them at slightly greater risk by making a longer journey and having to cross the articulated part of the tram vehicles to get to some of that priority seating. And if I'm honest, that is the big difference between the two, and that is the tension. And the decision is, where do you prioritise the priority seats? If you don't want those people to are able to cross that articulated area safely, then option 2 becomes a viable alternative. If you're comfortable with that, then we can move on after trades. We can discuss whether we use the space between the doors, not just for wheelchair users, but also for cycle carriage, if we can make that safely. And that is the crux of the tension that we're faced with. Through the consultation, we also had a couple of other options 3 and 4 for clarity in today's report, put forward by cycle users. And they were suggesting we dedicate other parts of the tram for cycle storage, one at the front end or rear end of the tram, depending which way it's going, and the other in the middle of the trams. The suggestion was that those are used for tip-up seats, but in reality, because of the need to raise in boxes the floor of the tram vehicle to accommodate the wheels and other mechanics, it isn't a case of flip-up seats or cycle storage. It's actually storage or seats. My view, the demand and the customer concerns about the level of seating on the existing tram fleet suggests to me that it's not safe to be one carrying cycles up steps and into storage space, and I'm not sure that it's wisest to remove seating altogether to create occasional use storage space. So in my mind, options 3 and 4 are unfavoured, and that's certainly again the view of the councils, who's bring it back down to debate is option 1 or option 2. The paper also covers 1 or 2 other suggestions like external racks, but in reality they aren't viable or safe options that I could commend to you, and are actually illegal to use some of those in the UK. So, moving away from the vehicle itself, page 24 then considers what can we learn from the existing use of the existing super tram vehicles, and how does that use and demand influence today's decision making. And paragraph 362 makes clear that there is a fair amount of trams, roughly 50% of trams at some stage on their journey carry push chairs or wheelchairs in the low floor space, and makes the point that the priority seating is extremely well used, and with the protected groups it is up to 70 to 100% use of those seats are used by pregnant, elderly, infirm and so on. So the priority seats are extremely well used by the intended customer base. So the conclusion, the report has to make a recommendation. It is suggesting option 1, and it does that because, in my view, the elderly and infirm having to cross the articulated area of the tram is of concern. It is a risk. It is a risk you may choose to take. So I need to be clear, option 2 is a viable alternative, but it does simply come down to a choice of risk and benefit, and options 1 or 2 have the pros and cons as I've outlined. Option 2, as I've said, has the risk for those priority seat users, but clearly it has the benefit of creating a space which may be usable for cyclists. But if I can go back to where I started, today's discussion is about the design of the vehicle. That is what we have to instruct the manufacturer on. If you make a decision that follows the recommendation and goes for design option 1, at that stage we preclude the option of carrying cycles. If this meeting goes for option 2, we are not making a decision to carry cycles on these tram train vehicles. We are making a decision to approve a design that could accommodate the carriage of cycles. We would then have to consider, in conjunction with the operator Supertram, who carry the legal duty of safety, we would have to work with them about how could you safely carry cycles in that space. Ultimately, they carry the legal responsibility. That is their decision, but they may wish to have a discussion with us about the conditions under which they do that, and that may have implications for us which we would need to consider when those discussions have progressed. So you have to be absolutely clear about that. Today is not about we will be carrying cycles. It is a question about the design option, which designs in or out the possibility of carrying cycles. So hopefully I've covered the points in a sort of a fair and objective way. I do appreciate it's challenging. So if we perhaps go to Polly next, Chair.
Yeah. Okay, thanks very much for that, David. Polly, you do have 5 minutes. It is a presentation on behalf of the group that you represent. It's not a debate that we're going to have with you. That debate will take place between the ITA members. Polly, the floor's yours.
Okay, I'm Polly Blacker. I represent Cycle Sheffield, which is a campaigning group for cyclists in Sheffield, and we have more than 400 members across Sheffield. I've been through the report and made a lot of comments for myself, but I'm just going to make a few briefly for you. Particularly, this committee is quoted in the report 313 as having resolved with some reluctance to not supporting carriage of non-folding bikes by Supertram until the system utilises vehicles with adequate facilities. It should therefore be the case that the tram train internal layouts designed with adequate facilities. There's abundant experience from abroad where bikes are carried without problems, which has not been explored fully in this report. It's just simply been listed, and it could be investigated in South Yorkshire with a trial of bike carriage. I've experience of taking bikes on the trams in Brussels, and I've some photos of the information that is on the tram in Brussels, which, and there have been no problems. People naturally accommodate to the needs of others and move round and make space, and that's what happens on the trains here too, in fact, when you take a bike. We all agree that priority needs to be given to people with disabilities or who are elderly, pregnant or have children with them. But at the Transport for All and the Sheffield on the Move meetings, everyone there was supportive of a trial of bike carriage as well. From my experience, the risk of conflict is overemphasised in this report. And then in the final section on implications 4.3, it states that there's no risk of disorder. We're simply asking for a trial of bike carriage, And as this is an additional service, this is the best opportunity for looking at it. Priorities, time conditions and all those things could be worked out. Finally, we do have responsibility for this as a national pilot. It's contradictory in the report to suggest that carriage of bikes on future systems is an option, 321, 351 and 41, and then also state that changes to the blueprint design can be costly or impossible to make. When this is rolled out locally and nationally to Doncaster, to Stocksbridge and to Worksop and other areas, if this is replacing rather than an additional service, it will be removing carriage of bikes, and this is an opportunity with an additional service for us to trial the carriage of bikes. And I've had emails from 5 of the 6 Sheffield MPs. I've not heard back from Angela Smith yet, saying that they've contacted the Minister for Transport in support of bike carriage during the trial. Okay. I've got lots of other points, but I think those are the principal ones, and I don't feel it's up to the cyclists to suggest the options. Actually, I think it's up to the, we don't design cars ourselves. We go and ask somebody to design one for us. We need to have an option looking at the experience elsewhere where it's been perfectly successful.
Okay, thanks very much, Polly. Any questions from members to Polly? Alan?
Yeah, I'm trying to. I've gone through this report again. I can't see. I've an understanding of the difference in heights of low and high level within the carriage. It doesn't give me a. It just says low and high, raised floor level. I'm not quite sure what we're talking about.
David and Polly won't respond to that. It's probably for the debate afterwards, but Dave.
Just for clarity, low floor up to the raised floor area on the current tram system involves 3 steps. On the tram train vehicle, we have managed to reduce that to 1 step, but in doing so, that is why we have got the boxes upon which the seats are sat in the main body. So it's 1 step in the floor area.
9 inches, 12 inches. 9 inches.
Yeah.
9 inches.
And I understand that's due to the axle.
That's right.
So that's the reason why.
Why don't we make it all one level? And
We can, because of the axle.
It's a very
let me finish.
Okay.
Why can't we make it all flat and increase the loading point by 9 inches?
Right, the difficulty is we have designed the platform heights, which are low height platforms, to be safe to work on street. But in doing so, therefore, we have to work a system that has tram train vehicles and the existing Supertram fleet. Our existing Supertram fleet are designed around the current platform heights, and therefore we have to design the new vehicles to work around the existing infrastructure as well.
That means to say that if you have 2 heights on a platform, you'd have a gradient within the existing platform. The actual carriages might move a metre further along the carriage for one loading and a metre back for new loading.
Yeah.
Are you with that?
No.
The door on a carriage, how wide is the door on the carriage?
2 metres.
2 metres, right. So we have a platform that's 50. In 2 points, if you've got 2 access points. If you're going to load the carriage that is low area, this is 9 inches higher. There, that's 9 inches higher. You move the older type along another 2 metres to give you access.
No, you can't.
Right.
This is for debate probably afterwards. It's not for questions to Polly. It's for.
There are 2, I think, concerns, Polly, that I've heard raised particularly. One, the issue about safety and things sticking out and falling over things, and particularly cycles, and even possibility about oil and grease getting onto passengers. And then the other thing is conflict and how that might be managed. And I just wonder what your experience has been of how conflict has been managed, if it has occurred, and the issue about things getting in the way if you allow carriage of cycles.
Okay, as regards things getting in the way, I've never had a problem with that. Bikes can be stored, the way that it's described in this report is to have them singly. In fact, on trains they're never stored singly, they're normally stored together. So there'd be a whole, maybe 2 or 3, depending on the train, and they'd be stored together. But they're stored in an area, and usually the cyclists will either sit or stand beside them. In other places, in Salzburg, for example, they have them hanging, like we do on the Virgin trains here, and they have seats next to each bike all the way along a carriage, and there's not been any conflict there when I've taken a bike on those trains. We have had to carry bikes in Eastern Europe up steep steps, and we've managed that, and people have moved, and they're very narrow, much narrower than ours, and it's quite difficult. But people don't conflict. People generally help one another. I help people with buggies often. I help people who are partially sighted. I don't think this conflict is a problem. The only times that I've had difficulties on the trains in this country have been when there have been more bikes than there's space for, and then I've had to wait for another one. One time going to Liverpool, I'd got reserved place for my bike, well, 2 of us, and people were standing in that area, and we got on, and the people were moving, but the train manager decided that we should not get on, even though we'd got reserved seats and there was space, and we had to get off and wait for another train, which was an hour later. And that was quite worrying, because we didn't know we'd necessarily get on the next one because we hadn't got reservations. But that issue has been resolved quite a lot, because the Norwich to Liverpool service, they're making longer trains now, and it's not as congested as it was. But with this service, this is an additional service. There are 5 ways, I think, of getting to Rotherham. There's 2 rapid buses, there's an ordinary bus, there's a train, and there's now going to be the tram train. And this is an additional service, so it's an optimum time to look at carriage of bikes, in my opinion. Just a trial, just for any period of the day. It could be late on a Sunday, any time, just to see how it could work, is what we're asking for.
Thank you. Any other questions to Polly? If not, thank you very much for your presentation, Polly. You're free to stay or go. As a member of the public, it's up to yourself. Okay. So, questions to officers, colleagues? Alan, same question.
Answer 2.
Yeah.
Yes, the difference in height between a full-height train platform and a tram platform, you couldn't sensibly have the ramps and the 2 different tram heights co-located in the one area. You would have to build completely separate platforms. That was dismissed in the original design of the Supertram system, because many of the stops are on street, and the ability of accommodating the ramps, gradients and full height that is necessary for a full height platform couldn't be accommodated within the existing highway space. So it isn't, I don't believe, a viable solution. So therefore we are constrained by having tram vehicles that can serve the current tram height platforms.
Thank you. Any other questions to officers? Yes, Lee.
On the... it's always awkward about whether you do kind of like the comments and stuff or you do the questions first, but I'll stick to the questions first. You know, on the 2 designs, I think I think first of all, our point of view, my point of view is that I agree that option 3 and 4 aren't ones we want to pursue. On option 2, it's got the 4 seats that are on each section that are for priority users. Can you just confirm whether it looks like the 2 front seats, if you depending on which way you're travelling, the 2 seats that are those priority seats that are towards either side of the tram are on the lower section of the tram? Is that correct?
Yes, they are on the lower section of the tram. The two nearest the doors.
Right. So when we're talking about basically 4 of the 8 would be on the lower section under option 2. 4 would be on the step up.
That's correct. Yes.
Right. Okay. I think. I mean, our view would be that, obviously, as we've stated in the paper, I think that we promote option 2. It's a decision between, for all of us, and especially Rotherham and Sheffield. Only insofar as the fact that we think that because this is a trial, it ought to be looked at. We recognise that there are difficult balancing acts here, and there may be a point at which it's actually not viable because of the issue around people who are infirm or have disabilities. But given that, and then do the trial, and then if it didn't work, how easy it would be to kind of retrofit it to kind of like accommodate, option 1 in effect. And in terms of kind of slight amendment of the seating and so on and so forth, that could be designed into the possibility to do that could be designed in option 2. Then, and if that was at a relatively modest cost to retrofit in that respect, then I think that would be the option that we would think would give everyone some comfort that we can trial it, have a look at it, see if it works, and if it proves not to do so, then we could make those amendments to still get the optimal option 1, but having done a trial of it, so we can have a look at it and see if it does work. I do think that if we did do any kind of trial, and I said this before, I think you need to be very clear about what you're actually trialling. I don't think there's any point doing a trial that wouldn't actually be trialling what you would actually be proposing to do. So if you were going to trial it off-peak, but then you were proposing to run it through peak hours, there's no point in that. You need to trial what actually is being proposed. If you're only proposing off-peak, then that's fine to do an off-peak trial. So, but I think that's where our support for option 2 would be. And let's have a look at how we could just have a look at this for a trial. But we accept that there are some difficult issues in this respect.
It's certainly case. Today we're talking about design of the vehicle. You could choose to procure design option 2. And in the event you wanted to make alterations to it, in this case, put fixed permanent priority seating between the 2 doors, you can do that retrospectively. The difficulty is we would have to find the funding at that time to do it, and clearly there are implications. At this stage, seating and fitting the seating in the future, that would have to be found locally for the 7 tram train vehicles that we're procuring.
Yeah, I mean, our view, having looked at it, is that will be quite a modest cost. Now, it would be additional cost. I think we were prepared to look at perhaps funding that from our cycling LTP allocation, if that wasn't, a prohibitive figure, to allow this to be looked at as one option, for example, that would enable us to move forward with option 2. That's just a suggestion. I don't know if I suspect our other Labour members might support that. I don't know about Ian, but that would seem that's one potential option to allow us to move forward on that basis.
Tim. Thank you, Chair. I don't know a great deal about this. We haven't got it in Doncaster, so I've got very little knowledge on it. But I was wondering how many seats are there in each option? How many people are able to stand? How often are all the seats full, as in what capacity are you envisaging? And how often are all the priority seats full as well? Because obviously there must be super tram with those at the moment.
The existing super tram, in terms of use of priority seats, they are almost always used. There's about 60 to 100% occupancy rate by the vulnerable people. So priority seating is needed and is extremely well used. We know, particularly on the yellow route, which is the one out to Meadow Hall, I'm mindful that many of the tram train vehicles will be on that corridor past the arena to Meadow Hall South, and then on to Rotherham and Parkgate. We know that is the busiest corridor, with standing at many times of the day, because of not just the commuter traffic, but also the shopping attracted by Meadow Hall and major events at the leisure facilities and Sheffield Arena down that corridor. So it is quite common to find standing, even throughout the day and into the evening, depending on what events and activities are happening. Overall passenger numbers, typically you get about 160 people seated and standing on a current Supertram. This is not a lot different to that, but that sort of capacity numbers, theoretically you can actually accommodate up to 200, but that depends on people moving right down to the middle of the vehicle. And as we know from the existing trams, as just as much trains, people don't like to feel trapped in the middle of the vehicles, so tend to congregate around the doors. So when you've got standing, that's the first place people choose to stand.
Tim?
Thanks, Chair. First off, with a question and then comment. I mean, the first question is a point that Polly made about the report and the fact that it doesn't, in any great depth, go into the experience of cycle and tram usage on continental Europe. And I just wanted a little bit more explanation as to why that is and what is your experience and knowledge of that, because it seems, from my experience using tram systems abroad and from what Polly's said, there is very little, if any, conflict between cycle users and disabled and elderly people, infirm people at all. So I'd just like a little bit more explanation on that. And then just in terms of comment, Chair, I mean, obviously, Sheffield City Council, we moved a motion at Council some time back, and it got gained cross-party support that we should be looking at least trialling access for cycles onto the trams, and I think absolutely agree with what Lee said, that this is a perfect opportunity. This is a trial, and all we're asking is for a period of a trial period, and that the design process that we agreed today should be able to facilitate that trial period. And I have to say that, you know, for nearly 2 years I worked in Mexborough, and I obviously wasn't using tram, but I was using the train, cycling to the train station every day, getting on the train with a bike and getting off it and then cycling to work. And there was never, in that 2-year period, and I was doing it 5 days a week, I never once came across any conflict between users. And I must say, the space that's allocated on the train service, on that local service, was far more cramped than anything I've ever seen on trams, and there was never any conflict whatsoever. If there ever were occasions when the train was full, then cycle users simply stepped back and allowed other users on first, and it was simply a common sense approach, and it worked very, very well. And I see absolutely no reason why that can't happen on the tram train system that we're going to be introducing in South Yorkshire. I think one thing that we could look at is initially allowing the trial off peak, because I would fully accept that at peak periods the trams are very, very full, and it would be nigh on impossible to get a bike on, and I think bike users themselves would fully accept that in peak periods it can't happen. But I would differ from David's version of events on the Lower Don Valley route itself. I mean, I'm a tram user quite regularly myself, and again off peak, I can think of very few examples where there isn't more than ample space for wheelchair users and cyclists to get onto trams. I accept there are odd occasions when there might be an event in the arena where at certain times, again, it might be problematic, but I think, again, my experience and experience from elsewhere is that it is a common sense approach, and cyclists will step aside and allow vulnerable users on first. And, you know, as long as we have got the correct procedures in place, signage, what we've already seen examples from Brussels, you know, I see absolutely no reason why this cannot at least be trialled, and then we have a report back on the experience of that trial period. And if it is not working, if there is conflict, if disabled people, if elderly people are being inconvenienced, then I will have no problems whatsoever in ending that trial period. But I have absolutely every confidence that this can work, and that people have got enough common sense between them to make this work, and it is a trial, and it should be allowed to happen.
Thank you very much. Ian, you want to respond?
Just to pick up a few points. We've spoken to a number of. Well, we've spoken firstly to the manufacturer of the vehicle, who clearly manufactures for a number of these systems around Europe and indeed further than that, and sought their advice on how to accommodate cyclists. We've looked at a number of the tram systems around Europe about how they can accommodate. There are considerable differences in culture and level of use of the trams across Europe, and there is no exact match for the Sheffield system. So therefore we have to make a local decision on that. And I think that's absolutely right, because the risks are local risks, but we can clearly learn from elsewhere. We've met with Transport for London, for example, who are just completed a trial on Docklands Light Rail, allowing the carriage of cycles off-peak. And some of the things we've learnt from that are they've had to put extra staff on, as well as fund considerable information provision. And for a 6-month trial, that cost them nearly £600,000. That sort of funding, we'll come to later on the agenda, is not the sort of funding we have. But for me, that isn't a factor in the decision today. The crux of the issue we have today is use of the low floor space. Are we comfortable with taking people who depend on priority seating across the articulated part of the tram with the brake in the handrails? If we're comfortable with that and the risks associated with that, then option 2 is an option we can pursue. If we're not comfortable with that, we are led to option 1. There is no conflict, in my view, between wheelchair users, just to correct you if I may. Wheelchair users under both options continue to have a dedicated space in the low floor part of the tram, and therefore works equally under option 1 and option 2. And as referenced by the case law in first buses encountered in West Yorkshire, they have to provide priority by law for wheelchair users until that decision is appealed and challenged through the appeal process. So to me, it's about the elderly and infirm, or people who depend on the priority seats. Are we comfortable with them crossing the articulated area and walking further to the priority seating, or do we want the priority seating as close as possible to the door? And that chooses your design option. At that stage, if you choose option 2, we can then have a discussion around a design vehicle, how we can make it work, under what conditions, at what times. That's when, if you go for option 2, we can bring back further reports on how we could make a trial work and under what conditions. But you don't get to how you would make a trial work and under what conditions until you have chosen the design of the vehicle to run on the system, and that's today's decision.
Okay, Ian, and then I'll come back to you later.
Thank you, Chair. We've had a consultation, Chair, and I think that we should try and deliver what the consultation is telling us, if we possibly can, because otherwise you get a feeling amongst the people you're asking that you're not taking sufficient notice of what they're saying. And in the consultation responses and in the consultation meetings that I've attended personally, I've got to tell you, I've not seen any conflict between the stated position of cyclists and the stated position of Transport for All, for example. There doesn't seem to be a conflict between the running order, between the acceptance that people with disabilities should get priority overall, that carriage of cycles should come as bottom of the list in terms of priorities. So it seems to me we do have an option on the table in option 2 in the design stage that holds out the possibility of us delivering what seems to be a view that has come out of the consultation, and I think we should try and do that. The next thing is, I don't understand some of the problems that have been set up. I think to some extent Stagecoach Supertram are setting up problems that in all my time travelling on public transport, where cycles are carried and there is the potential for conflict, I can honestly say I've almost never seen it. Generally you're dealing with reasonable people who will self-manage situations, so I think some of the problems are overstated. On the cost, and this is something you might be able to comment on, I think we're talking about four sets of tip-up seats versus 4 sets of rigid seats, but that might be, you know, oversimplifying it. But surely the manufacturer can accommodate that. They are bolted in. So because rooms you can bolt out one set, bolt out another set. You can make provision for tip-up seats, and therefore, if Councillor Bramwell's suggestion that Sheffield could fund that, better get ready with the minuting of this so that it's clear. I would certainly think that is the sensible way forward, and I wouldn't have a problem with that as well. Thanks, Chair.
Yes, I think there are a couple of points in response to that. You're absolutely right. There is very broad consensus about the hierarchy of users. But through the consultation, the other factor that you may wish to give consideration to was people were also clear they wanted priority seating as close to the door as practicable. And that came out strongly. And that's the difference between options 1 and options 2. In terms of the seating, for priority seating, it has to be fixed seating. We can't have tip-up seat. And therefore, the issue is, do you have a standing space there or potentially the option fold-up seats versus having fixed static seats, which, of course, would preclude, if they were between the door space, that would be the space that you would put bicycles. So under that scenario, if you've got the fixed seats, you can't have cycles.
Got Lee and then Alan.
Thank you, Chair. Just a couple of comments and then a question. I think I take the point about the Docklands Light Railway trial, but I'm not convinced. Well, let me finish. But I'm not convinced, which is maybe answering your point, Tim, that they're kind of comparable. I mean, one system is operating in the biggest city in the European Union, going to one of the financial districts of that financial capital, feeds a city area of 12 million, where and the rest of the underground network feeds that LDV, the Light Dockland Railway, so LDR system. So I suspect the kind of pressures, and they're also narrow trains, because I've been on it several times. I worked for a short time at Canary Wharf, so I went on it, and so I think it's a different system in that respect, and you often have to go upstairs as well to get to the stations and so on and so forth. So I think it's a different scenario. I think, to me, I mean, this is about, like I say, it's about a trial, and we have to bear in mind what this organisation is called. It's called the Integrated Transport Authority, and integration is the key point, I think, here, and therefore, if we're going to trial something and be bold about it, I think this is the time. And that kind of, it goes to the heart of it. I think with option 2, I've not heard anything really that says anything other than that for a very small amount of money, potentially, or for a one-off opportunity that's not going to come across again, we could actually trial option 2, and then we could revert back to, in effect, overcoming the perceived negatives that have been put forward for option 2, if the trial proved not to be a success for a relatively small amount of money, and therefore, given this is a one-off trial, a national pilot, this would be the time to try that. And thinking about an integrated transport network, and reducing congestion, allowing areas that are becoming increasingly isolated potential because of the reductions in things like the rural subsidy grant for bus services and so on, to allow them to access public transport in this way that they can use. I think we ought to be looking at that. So I think on that basis, there's nothing I've heard that rules out option 2, notwithstanding the point that we recognise there's some challenges and so on. Just a quick question, I think, with respect to that. I think part of the problem I have is that it's been put forward as if, say, half the seats already on option 2 would be in the lower area anyway, as would be the wheelchair spaces. So we're talking about 4 seats that are actually on the higher level, and it's 1 step rather than 3 on the current system. But on the current tram system, it's not going to be the case, is it, that there just happens to be the right number of people seeking priority seats as there are available. There are going to be times where there are more people who seek priority seats, and there aren't the seats available because they're already full with priority users. So they presumably on the current network are therefore climbing onto the up 3 steps to get to the seating that is on the current tram system. Now, have we got any record that there's been any problems with that on the current system where they're having to go up 3 steps? And if there is an absence of that information, I would suggest that therefore it's highly unlikely there will be a problem with this design, which only has 1 step.
I mean, yeah, well used, the integrated transport lead, but I think it was for a different reason. Yeah, you used it very well, David.
Yes, there are clearly examples where all the priority seatings on the existing tram system are fully occupied and therefore people have to find alternative seating. And indeed, some of the priority seats on the current Supertram system do involve people going up the 3 steps to 2 of the 5 seats at each end of the tram, but they don't cross the articulated area, and that's the difference between the 2 scenarios here. There are a number of instances of people slip tripping and falling on the existing tram fleet, as you will find on buses and on the street. Similar system, albeit one that's fully low floor because it's got the full height platform. It was the best I could go to in the UK to gain learning, and I felt it's important that I shared at least the way they've managed the risk of that has imported cost to them, and that was the point I was trying to get across, that if we do it here, there may well be costs that come our way. I was simply just trying to draw the parallel in the risk mitigation. I certainly wasn't trying to imply DLR was the
problem with the priority users going up the step and using either the 2 seats, which I take the point about, they might not be in the articulated area, but there will obviously be, I would have thought, quite often instances where potential priority users, elderly, whatever, are using the normal regular seats, that aren't set aside for priority. There's no indication there's been an issue with that to date over, I don't know, 20 years of operation of the tram or whatever.
I look at numbers of incident reports. It's not hit my radar that there is a particular problem, and nor has Supertram raised that point with me either. So I am guessing here, but that suggests to me the risk is low, but it's not immaterial.
I have 2 other speakers indicate that I intend to wind up the debate on this particular issue, so we don't revisit the same issues multiple times.
Sorry.
Oh, sorry.
I thought we were asking questions and we were going to have the debate after. Sorry, when you spoke, we're asking questions. I listened to all this that's going on.
Yeah.
They were very good, but there was never a question in them. Anyway, they're all systems, really.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Okay.
Well, yeah, you might have done, but
Okay.
that one who speaks.
Okay. I'll put your name down, Roy.
Take our new colleague first.
Okay.
Chair. And I know Richard's had it.
Richard indicated before me, I think. Is it?
Yeah, Richard's indicated, yes.
Before me, you can take.
I'll put you last then.
Yeah.
I didn't realise the Berlin Wall was still up between Sheffield and Rotherham. Barnsley people do use the Supertram. I myself use the Supertram when I need to, when I travel into Sheffield. I find it very convenient. But why we're supporting option 1 is that I was the chairman of the Access Committee for Barnsley for some time. And many of our meetings, these people haven't got an option. They need the bus, they need the tram, they need the low floors, because some of the disabilities they've got, they can't move very far, and they need to be able to get through their lives. I'm sorry, but people with cycles have got an option to get off and cycle. That's what they're there for. Well, these people haven't got a choice, so we need to maximise the kind of access they've got on these new trams. And I thought we were saying we're going for either one design or the other today. Now, we're clearly, David and myself, are going for option 1. We're actually pushing at the moment for a lot of savings to be made out of these budgets. If we had to start taking seats out, we're reducing income that's potentially coming into them. So I'm very worried about that one. And demand for, so when I've been on them, the people that's got mobility problems are there, and they're taking the seats up, and they're very pleased to be able to use that extra facility. And I say straight away, I'm not against cyclists, I do cycle myself sometimes. So let's be clear, I want to be from a point of view of people that really need the service. and it's well used and it does work, and we need to maintain that in these new designs. So we will be going for option 1.
Okay. Thanks very much for that, Richard.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Usual suspect. I can tell you this now, and I'll definitely be going for option 1, and for a lot of reasons. You can keep throwing red herrings in about how it works in Brussels and how it works abroad. Different mindset, different facilities, different trams. I'm 100% behind what Roy said. I believe in people with disabilities and having good accessibility for them. I'm of the same opinion as Roy, and I've spoken to Paul previously. I believe if you can ride a bike, ride it. A tram is for getting people back and forward. Just because there's a few hills they've got to go up or they've got to go another distance ain't an excuse for me to shove people about on a tram with accessibility. There's 8 UK tram systems operating at the moment in Great Britain, in the United Kingdom. There's only one that has had a trial, and that was Docklands Light. And let's get the difference there, that was Docklands Light Railway. This question's been brought up by cycle groups in other areas for trams, and it was mentioned for the Edinburgh tram, and that ain't running yet. And that was discounted, because if you look at the design of them. There's 8, and only one's had a trial, and that's in UK, and I'm sorry, I live in UK. I'm worried about my disabled people, and a lot of the people in the South Yorkshire area who are now getting elderly, who've worked in heavy industry, with all the problems of mobility. And as regards the 3 steps, Lee, and I'm moving up because they've gone up 3 steps when mobility seats have been there. I have 2 disabled persons in my house, and when them seats have not been available, they've stood, they've grabbed hold while one came available. And now you'll find out a lot of disabled people will not go up them 3 steps because they can't. They can step up a step to get on, and they struggle to get on there, and that's why they want to be near the door. To ask them to go further into the train across an articulated is a nonsense to me. And I can assure you that if Gerald had been here, Gerald wanted to try a trial. And I'll make the point, Gerald, until I've had a few other goes at him, and he said he'd look at a trial, but I'll tell you this now. A trial proves nothing off-peak, nothing whatsoever. It does not prove anything, because when you're going to get your conflicts and your major problems is at peak times. And we're talking about taking a lump of metal with sharp edges that's over 6 foot long onto a tram at busy times, and there ain't many bikes that's less than 6 foot in length. And if it actually, you're not thinking about the visually impaired. I'll be going for option 1, and in fact at 2.2 I'd have taken that folding bike out, because I don't think that's right carting one of them on. But we are where we are, and I'll be quite specific. I don't care if Sheffield want to throw all the money at it. I will still vote against option 2. And I can tell you this, they've not obviously worked with rail companies or carriage makers, but I can tell you this, if you think it's an insufficient sum of money to retrofit something like that, I can tell you this, it won't be. You'd be surprised at how much it'll cost you. I worked in the railway industry for a while, and I know what sort of costs go in for things. And procuring vehicles, which I've had a lot to do with over years, procuring vehicles and trying to have them retrofitted, they don't half sting you, and they'll be no different to anybody else. So for that, all them reasons, and for to protect the vulnerable in our society, I will not be voting for option 2. It'll be option 1 as recommendation. I think either Councillor Russell's misunderstood or misinterpreting what we were saying. I think what we were saying is that we would like to run a trial off-peak with a view to it being implemented. If it was successful off-peak, no one's for a minute is suggesting that if it was successful off-peak, we would then introduce it 24 hours, you know, for the whole duration that the trams are operating at all. I thought it was quite clear in saying that what we'd like to trial is an off-peak trial with a view to introducing it off-peak, because I said quite clearly myself that at peak times you physically could not get a bike onto the tram. So no, I don't think anyone for a minute is suggesting that we would even go there.
Thank you, Chair. It's quite right, Barnsley say, if you've got a bike, use it. And I've an understanding, and I had a brief discussion with David about cycling from where it starts to where it finishes in real terms. It's not very far, but then there might be a fact of connectivity. I might get off at Meadowhall and actually get the Transpennine train. My experience of cycling and trains is that, and that's from Manchester towards Sheffield, is it created rather no inconvenience at all by the carriage that was used. I think it was Pennine cross country Transpennine that was used, and it didn't interfere the access round where the bike was put. I'm interested to the point about how we store the bikes. It seemed to suggest that the two bikes are just wheeled on and put to one side. About the options of actually storing them more appropriately to reduce the actual space that's taken up. Why do we have to, this is a question, why do we have to have 4 doors? Why don't we look at reducing the number of doors to actually enable seats to be put in those places at one end? I can put at least 4 seats where the 2 doors are opposite at one end, which takes no problem from my point of view. Would reduce the cost of actually the ancillary equipment to work doors on a vehicle, and actually accommodate 2 cycles in one area, which enables you to actually look at accommodating these people, disabled people, at the other end without any inconvenience. You know that cycles are designated in one area, and therefore I don't see it as much of a problem to actually overcome those obstacles. Thank you, Chair.
Can
I just add? And if that was the case, I would support option 2.
Unfortunately, reducing the number of doors isn't something I'd recommend. You're carrying a significant number of people. You have to get them on and off very swiftly. Our tram boarding time is at 8 to 10 seconds. It would considerably prolong the journey time and cause problems with the existing super tram vehicles, which of course have 4 doors. And we're trying to align the doors to the tactile paving, and unfortunately blind people wouldn't know whether a 4-door or a 2-door tram was turning up, so it's not a solution I would recommend. It has to work with the existing infrastructure.
Thank you. I mean, I think, exhausted.
The point about being concentrated in one area, I think that's a worthwhile option.
But not one that's feasible to match in with the current tram system. Well, we've already got the trams in Sheffield, Alan. Already, it's there. The infrastructure's already in. And the one point that Richard made that was absolutely true is that Stagecoach have said quite clearly that they don't support it, and it's the safety risk to the operator that they'll consider, not any of the other issues. So, colleagues, we need to vote on this particular item now. Recommendation 1. All those in favour, please show. 1, 2. Item 12, colleagues, on the agenda is the Local Transport Plan 3 Capital Programme for 2013-14, the second quarter update. Andrew, this is your...
Yeah, thank you, Chair. I'll be as brief and concise as possible. Members will recall that we undertake regular delivery reviews